China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Andrew Wilson. Our top stories. Start spending. China acts to stimulate consumer consumption as manufacturing and service activity lose steam in July.
A glimmer of hope. The Eurozone's economy shows signs of resilience as its second quarter GDP beats expectations.
Niger's ousted president seen for the first time since a military coup last week as the leader of neighbouring Chad heads up mediation efforts.
And Britain's Prime Minister confirms plans for over 100 new oil and gas drilling licences. Environmental groups call it short-sighted and selfish. China has unveiled a series of measures to boost consumer spending after new data showed economic activity continued to shrink in July.
Chinese markets rallied on the announcement. Our correspondent Li Juanhua is following the story. Juanhua, what have you got for us?
As Andrew and Robin, China's manufacturing purchasing managers index came in at 49.3 for July. It has seen an uptake since April, but has remained under 50. See the red dotted line over there? It means China's factory activity has been contracting over the past 4 months. The official non-manufacturing PMI reading, namely China's service industry, came in at 51.5 in July, which means an expansion in service activity. But this is the lowest growth so far this year. In the latest attempt to boost the country's economy, Chinese authorities rolled out 20 measures to boost consumer spending. They include easing restrictions on car purchases, particularly new energy cars including EVs, support for home upgrades and purchasing household appliances and electronics. The government is also encouraging people to spend more on dining, culture, tourism, sports and healthcare services. Boosting all of these efforts in rural areas is also a priority. And Hong Hao is chief economist at Grow Investment Group. I asked whether he thinks the measures will work.
I think it takes time to show. Obviously, the market is excited, at the prospect of, some consumption stimulus, and also, in the past, car purchase restriction removal, and also assistance, in many other consumption areas did help the Chinese consumption to recover. So I don't think this time we will see a different story. So more likely than not, we will see eventually consumption to recover, but it will take some time.
And investors have been expecting some stimulus measures. Do you think these are in line with most of their expectations?
I think the market was hoping for example, some explicit support for domestic consumption, such as consumption coupon or even cash distribution, like the Western economies did during the 3 years of pandemic. I think right now, we're seeing some very broad line, sort of the top level policy statements. It's up to the provincial governments and also local governments to roll out further details in the coming weeks. So I think just now, as we were speaking, there were news about some cities trying to implement the support policies for the property sector. So I think in the coming weeks, we are likely to see more and more such detailed announcements.
And one of the priorities is boosting domestic spending. Do you think the general public now are willing to spend more? A great many are really careful with each penny they spend after the pandemic.
Yeah, I think right now, we're seeing national savings rate is at all-time high. And also in the first half of the year, the Chinese consumer saved 18 trillion yuan, which is like double a full years of saving, in a normal year. So it's really showing that, people are risk averse. They're not yet at a very confident level, to spend the money. And also because of the property sector, it is still trying to recover. Right, so therefore, credit expansion is not really as strong as it should be at this stage of the economic cycle. So I think time will tell. But obviously, once the consumer confidence comes back, then I won't be surprised to see them spending the money.
And speaking of China's property sector, are we seeing a change of tone here?
There is certainly a change of tone in the stock price. I mean, many of the property developer stocks has been doing really well, right? So, it's up 20%, 30% plus in a day. So we haven't seen this kind of stock price surge for a long time now. Many people may have already given up on the sector, but now, precisely at this juncture, the property stocks are coming back to life. I mean, they're coming back for a good reason. I mean, obviously, we're seeing the Politburo meeting not mentioning about, houses are not for speculation, it's for living. So it's a signal that the policy curbs will be eased from here onwards.
The Eurozone economy returned to growth in the period between March and June, generating a glimmer of hope that the bloc may avoid recession. GDP rose 0.3% on the previous quarter after a period of stagnation, and headline inflation fell to 5.3% in July. Well, let's talk to Vicky Price, the international economist and former joint head of the UK government's economic service. Welcome back to the programme, Vicky. So we talked last week about the ECB not having a clear view of the path ahead when it comes to interest rates and tackling inflation. Do these numbers give them something more to go on?
Well, the interesting thing is that it's a bit of a confusing picture. You have some countries doing reasonably well. You've mentioned the 0.3% increase in GDP in the second quarter, which was better than the previous quarter where there was stagnation. But within that, you have great variability. You have Germany not doing well, in fact, stagnating itself rather than growing. You have France actually doing surprisingly, better than had been anticipated, mainly on the back of exports, which is interesting in itself. And you've got Italy not really performing, also seeing, quite a slowdown in its own performance. And you have Spain doing okay, but I'm now focusing, of course, on the large economies, and Spain's growth moderating a little bit, but at least growing. But inflation is moving in the right direction, and it's moving in the right direction in almost all countries in Europe. So if you look at the fact that we're not seeing that much growth, yes, some countries are doing better than others, and the fact that inflation is indeed slowing down and may well slow down even further. Yes, there are some slight tweaks. So Spanish inflation came up a little bit from where it was, but it's still pretty low. It's just over 2%. So we can't complain too much. German inflation has come down. So on the basis of all this, you would wonder whether there is a real need for an increase in interest rates by the ECB when they meet next.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Germany, if we can. Obviously, the powerhouse economy of the EU, but stagnating, really. How much of a concern is its performance?
Well, it is worrying generally because you're quite right. It's a locomotive for growth for the rest of the EU. What it has, of course, seen is a drop in manufacturing demand. I mean, that's basically what has hit its own growth because it's so dependent on that. And if you look at manufacturing growth worldwide and manufacturing exports worldwide, there is an issue because the growth in the OECD, certainly in the advanced world, is being driven mainly by services and not by manufacturing. So obviously Germany suffers from this. Plus, of course, it has had to intervene to cut energy demand. So quite a lot of its energy-intensive industries have been suffering. You know that energy demand amazingly in Germany has dropped very significantly. So it's suffering from a combination of those factors. But there is an underlying strength still there. It has, a very firm industrial base, and the expectation is that what we're seeing right now will be short-lived.
Well, let's talk again about the Eurozone, because we saw that a headline inflation figure falling, but core inflation is the same. So is enough being done to tackle it?
The interesting thing about Europe is that the concerns that others have, such as the UK, is that wage growth is very substantial and therefore there is some built-in embedded inflation there for us to worry about. But the truth is, if you look at Europe, wages are not increasing particularly. I think this core inflation is something that needs to worry us, of course. But it isn't necessarily directly correlated with inflation. I mean, core inflation in Spain, for example, is considerably greater than what its overall inflation is. So there will be, I think, and there are already, signs that in itself is going to slow down. There is no real cost push as such, except in areas such as services, where demand is still very considerable in various countries and where prices are expected to continue to go up. But the rest I think we're seeing from all the evidences out there that core inflation itself is perhaps not going to be such a big issue in the months ahead.
Vicky, great to get your thoughts today. Thank you for being on the programme. That's Vicky Price, the international economist.
Yeah.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come, Britain green lights over 100 new licences for North Sea oil and gas extraction, but environmental groups see red.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. Britain's antitrust regulator has put out a call for public comments on whether Microsoft's $69 billion takeover of Activision Blizzard should get the go-ahead.
It comes after Microsoft submitted new details to the Competition and Markets Authority in a bid to push the deal through. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Karina Mitchell, who's in New York. Karina, good to talk to you. How much is at stake for Microsoft if this merger fails, do you think?
Yeah, well, happy Monday to you, Andrew and Robin. Well, quite a lot is at stake because Microsoft has made certain commitments, and if those fall through, then European approval will also fall through and become void. That could trigger a series of fines of as much as up to 10% of its global turnover, which could amount to as much as $20 billion based on its balance sheet last year. So let's talk about what some of these agreements are that it has in place. One is with NVIDIA, the other one is with a company called Boosteroid. And basically it says if the merger is successful, if it goes through, then those companies will be able to execute license agreements for Activision games for a period of up to 10 years after that merger, which they think is a good deal. Now, the company, Microsoft, said this already improves issues surrounding competition, and it improves the overall sector, the cloud gaming space. Now, it's also struck an agreement with its biggest rival, with Sony. Similar sort of story there, and if that merger is successful, then its Call of Duty game will be available on those PlayStation consoles for a period of 10 years. And it says that this is very significant because it shows there are no antitrust issues at play. They are trying to be fair, and it should appease any opponents to this deal, and it should go through. So there is a commentary period that's opened. It runs through August 4th, and then British regulators should make some sort of decision come one way or the other, whichever way they decide, by about August 29th, so before the end of August. Now, Microsoft has pushed through these several pieces to do everything they can. This is their final deal to try and help get this deal over the line. Of course, it comes as U.S. regulators tried to temporarily halt the deal. The FTC was unsuccessful there. Robin, Andrew.
And Karina, depressing news from one of the biggest trucking companies in the U.S. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, so Yellow is a company that's been in business for over 99 years, and it suddenly shut shop on Sunday. There was no notice or advance warning, so it really did come as a surprise. As I say, almost 100 years old. There are 30,000 employees nationally, and it was quite popular with its customers because it did offer some of the cheapest freight rates around. But they have been battling with the Teamsters union here over contributions tied to healthcare and pensions. They have about 22,000 union workers, and the union actually called for a strike last week, but then decided to call that off and give the company an extension of 1 month to make good on these contributions. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and they did in the end have to shut shop, and they are preparing for bankruptcy protection there. Now, the union said that Yellow has mismanaged their company in financing for years and years historically. They do say they took government funding, a bailout to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, essentially taxpayers' money that we're now on the hook for over here, and as well have benefited from billions in concessions from workers. So quite a tense situation there, Robin and Andrew.
Karina, thanks very much indeed. Karina Mitchell there in New York for us.
Environmental groups have criticised a decision by the British government to offer more than 100 new licences for oil and gas exploration drilling in the North Sea.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says it's entirely consistent with reaching net zero by 2050 and will boost the country's energy independence.
New carbon capture projects were also announced. I've been speaking to Anthony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House, a leading British think tank.
Unfortunately, what we've seen is the government getting out of balance the two policy objectives. One is securing energy supply, and the second is meeting climate change objectives. And I think that by awarding new licenses, what the government is doing is telling to other parts of the world, well, it's okay to develop your oil and gas licenses. And that goes against the trends that we're seeing. The International Energy Agency has said that the exploitation of any new oil and gas developments would unfortunately not enable us to meet the net zero target, so the internationally agreed 2050 climate objectives.
Well, as you point out, there has been criticism that these goals rather go against the country's climate aims to get to net zero by 2050. And the point being, shouldn't we be cutting back on fossil fuels rather than facilitating their greater use?
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, in some ways, what we've seen from your two previous reports is the significant and growing impacts of climate change. And if we continue to pollute, then these impacts will get far, far worse. So we do have to take a stand. The world has agreed objectives of trying to limit global warming to around 1.5 degrees. If we continue to open up oil and gas licenses, then those targets won't be met.
We should point out, of course, that these are just licences to look for gas and oil. It could potentially be years before any reserves that were found can actually be tapped. With that in mind, is this a backwards-looking move?
I think as you point out, it isn't something that will impact the energy supply in the UK immediately, and this is said to be a priority. As I mentioned before, the war in Ukraine has increased energy prices, did raise huge concerns over access to energy. And so therefore, what I think would be much better would be measures that can achieve or have an impact within the short term and also address both climate change and energy security simultaneously. And the two obvious examples of that are energy efficiency, whereby you either install equipment to reduce the amount of energy that you need, or you encourage people to change behavior so that they don't waste so much energy, both of which are quick to do and very cost effective. And then the second is to put in place new supply options that, again, are cheap and quick to do. And the two most obvious areas of that are onshore wind and renewables. And so if I were in government, those are the two areas, efficiency and onshore renewables, that I would prioritise in order to address the twin problems of energy security and climate change.
And what about the carbon capture element of this announcement? Some people have called that greenwashing, but is it that, or is it part of the future on the path towards net zero?
I mean, I think there are certain sectors in which carbon capture and storage may well play and is likely to play a really important part, in particular some of the heavy industrial processes like steel manufacturing. But I think if we try to say, well, we're going to develop a whole new set of fossil fuels because we're going to do CCS, I think in some ways it's misjudging timetables and possibilities. CCS is tested at a small scale, but has never been tested on the scale that would be necessary were it to be absolutely widespread in terms of its deployment.
We've also seen something of a watering down by the UK on reforms to the carbon market, effectively making it easier for industry to pollute here compared with countries in the EU. Are we seeing a bigger move away from climate-friendly policies in the UK?
I'm afraid that seems to be the indication. And it's not just the carbon market, the carbon prices that you talked about. We've seen various statements from the Prime Minister in terms of talking about the need for proportionate and sort of more rational environmental issues. We've seen the Secretary of State in charge of housing talking about potentially slowing down or putting back some of the targets for energy efficiency within households. And I think these are sending very worrying signals. The UK has seen itself and has been a leader in terms of climate change. It hosted very successfully the large international conference on climate change in 2021, COP26. But since then, it seems to be rolling back on some of these things. And I think as we go through to the next big climate summit in December of this year, I think the UK policies will be under a spotlight.
The Islamic State group has claimed responsibility for a suicide bombing in Pakistan which killed at least 54 people and wounded nearly 200. Hundreds of mourners have attended funerals in the northwestern province for the victims of Sunday's attack, which targeted a political gathering. Our correspondent Daniel Khan is in Islamabad.
The incident occurred when more than 400 JUIF members and supporters had gathered under a tent in the town of Khar near the Afghanistan border for a workers' convention. Authorities say the bomber detonated himself in close proximity to the stage. Among the casualties was JUIF leader Maulana Ziaullah Jan. The Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Inspector General of Police says 10 kilograms of explosives was used with ball bearings and other materials. An investigation has been launched, but the situation remains tense. Now, we know that Bajor is a remote district bordering Afghanistan and was once a focal point in the global war on terror. Over the past few months, Pakistan's law and order situation has significantly deteriorated, with the terrorist groups carrying out attacks across the country with alarming impunity. The militant group, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, whose talks broke down with Pakistan in November, has escalated its attacks, specifically targeting police in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and areas near the Afghanistan border. Meanwhile, insurgents in Balochistan province have also intensified their violent activities, forming an alliance with the TTP. Pakistan has expressed serious concerns about the banned Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan finding safe havens and operating with freedom in Afghanistan. Daniel Khan, CGTN, Islamabad.
Political divisions have emerged in Italy over the country's membership of China's Belt and Road Initiative. On Sunday, Italian Defence Minister Guido Crosetto said the decision to join the trading network in 2019 was improvised and atrocious.
However, former Minister and architect of Italy's membership, Michele Garacci, says the country is a natural terminal for the BRI and that leaving would bring disastrous economic consequences.
If Italy were to leave the Belt and Road, there would be disastrous economic consequences. Italy sells to China about 50 billion US dollars of goods. That's about 2.5%, 3% of our GDP. None of us analysts believe that if Italy were to do this wrong move to exit the Belt and Road, the relation could continue as before. That's not the case. It's like telling a girlfriend, we split up, but we will be friends. It's kind of not something you want to bet on. There is a misperception among some observers that if you're part of the European Union or you're allied of the United States, you cannot do business with China or cannot be in the Belt and Road. There are about 14, 15 other countries who are both in the Belt and Road, in the European Union, and members of the NATO. So doing business with China is not in contradiction, even because the United States, who is of course in the NATO, is exactly what they want. They want to do more business with China. They want to sell more made in America goods to China. All the things the European companies complain about, in the MOU of the Belt and Road, we have China committing to improving on those areas.
The president of Chad has been in Niger for talks with the leaders of a military coup after they detained the country's elected leader last week. Mahamat Idriss Deby also met President Mohamed Bazoum himself, the first time he's been seen since being removed from office. Deby is leading mediation efforts to end the crisis after the regional grouping of ECOWAS gave coup leaders a 7-day deadline to give up power or risk military action. CGTN's Ajak Mangut has more from Nairobi.
The Economic Community of West African States, that's ECOWAS, chaired by Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu, has condemned the takeover of President Mohamed Bazoum's government in strong terms.
In the event the authorities' demands are not met within 1 week, take all measures necessary to restore constitutional order in the Republic of Niger. Such measures may include the use of force.
The ECOWAS is going to cut off financial support to Niger, to cut off trade as well to the landlocked country.
I want us to be strong, forceful, and resolute about the survival of Bazoum, as well as the freedom and restoration of the constitutionally elected body in Nigeria.
ECOWAS also suspend Niger from the regional bloc, as is the case with Mali and Burkina Faso when the military took over the governments of those countries.
As you can see, it was the people of Niger who came out to demonstrate their discontent with a policy that has lasted 12 years. I think things are clear. We are telling ECOWAS that Niger belongs to us. It's not up to an individual from ECOWAS to come and insult himself on behalf of Niger. We reaffirm our support for the army.
But the coup leaders in Niger have, warned against any military intervention from the ECOWAS, and they've called on citizens in the capital, Niamey, to come out and protest against any military intervention by the ECOWAS. We've seen the European Union and, of course, France cutting off financial support to the country. The U.S. has also said it could do so. Niger, for example, is seen as a key ally of the U.S. and France in trying to fight this insurgency in the region, because the military governments of Burkina Faso and Mali are seen to sort of align with Russia as a strategic partner. So Niger was seen as a key ally or an important partner in trying to fight this insurgency that has, created a humanitarian crisis. And many fear that with this recent takeover of the government in Niger, it could complicate the efforts in trying to fight insecurity in the Sahel region. And with the cutting off of financial aid, many who are facing, hunger and malnutrition it could make a dire situation sort of worse than it is right now.
Quick reminder, you can get highlights, of course, from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. 2 people dead and more than 31,000 evacuated as heavy rainfall continues to batter Beijing.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen acts.
The difference is in the detail. The background.
Defense ministers from
The wider angle and perspective of every story. wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Andrew Wilson. The headlines again. Start spending. China acts to stimulate consumer consumption as manufacturing and service activity lose steam in July.
And a glimmer of hope for the Eurozone's economy as its second quarter GDP beats expectations.
Two people have died in Beijing as downpours continue to batter the city. China's capital recorded its heaviest rainfall this year as Typhoon Doksuri passed over.
Hundreds of roads were flooded, while 31,000 people were evacuated from their homes. Our correspondent Yu Li is in Beijing.
It's been raining for days in northern China. Apart from Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei and nearby provinces has also suffered from continuous downpours. In the mountainous suburban areas in the capital and nearby region, roads and bridges had collapsed. Vehicles and homes had been washed away. As you have mentioned, 2 people have been found dead caused by the rain. Thousands of people had been evacuated in suburban areas. The highest red alert was just issued for landslides in Fangshan district in the next 48 hours. Emergency rescue and disaster relief is in progress now. The situation in the city center is also quite worrying as the authorities downgraded the alert in several central districts during the day, but reissued the highest red alert hours ago for potential waterlogging. As for the latest, according to the latest weather forecast, the downpour will keep hitting the city until Tuesday night.
So what kind of disruption has this bad weather caused so far?
Well, residents were suggested to stay at home as much as possible. Scenic spots and museums were closed. Performance and sports activities have been suspended. Some companies and institutions have allowed employees to work from homes, and transportation had been largely disrupted. Nearly 200 flights had been cancelled. The highway was closed and the bus routes have been suspended. And earlier, 2 high-speed trains have been stranded for 30 hours. Currently, thousands of passengers and crew members have been evacuated to safe locations. As people are returning to work on Tuesday, there will be a big traffic jam to come in the morning.
In the Philippines, many parts of the country remain underwater after Typhoon Doksuri hit last week.
Meanwhile, another typhoon continues to intensify, worsening monsoon rains across the country. Our correspondent Gretchen Malalad reports.
The Philippines is still reeling from the effects of Typhoon Doksuri, which left more than a dozen people dead and over 1 million Filipinos affected. Now, Typhoon Kanun has intensified and it has accelerated over the Philippine Sea. Even if it's far from any landmass or will not make any landfall, it will continue to enhance the southwest monsoon and trigger occasional monsoon rains over the western portions of Luzon and Visayas Islands. We are experiencing a bit of relief from constant rains Monday morning, but rain clouds are still hovering on the horizon. I'm here in Malolos, Bulacan, in the village of Katmon. From where I am standing right now, it's only knee deep, but as you go further, the houses here are flooded up to chest deep. Residents here are still trying to recover from the aftermath of Typhoon Doksuri, but the threat of monsoon rains by Typhoon Kanun has even made the floods here higher. As you can see here, the river here has overflown and inundated the houses in this village.
My kids are with my mother-in-law because we don't have any place to sleep because our house is flooded. Our situation now is so difficult. We also haven't worked in days because we can't leave our families like this.
Our situation is hard. It's so difficult to keep all of our things dry and put them on a higher place in our house. Our appliances are heavy. We also need food and clean water.
The Bulacan Provincial Disaster Agency says that 95 villages in the 12 municipalities of the province are affected by the flooding. There's damage to agriculture and around 14,000 individuals were displaced. But it's not only here in Bulacan that has been badly affected by the typhoon. Several provinces in the northern Philippines like Cagayan, Ilocos Norte, Bataan, and Pampanga have reported serious flooding, agricultural damage, and hundreds of displaced families. The Weather Bureau says Typhoon Kanun has further intensified before dawn on Monday and now has a maximum sustained winds of 150 kilometers per hour from 140, and its gustiness is now up to 185 kilometers from 170. The typhoon is expected to leave the country between Tuesday morning and afternoon. It may pass close to Japan's Okinawa Island between Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning. Gretchen Malalad, CGTN, Bulacan Province.
Parts of Europe are suffering severe drought due to a combination of heat waves and a lack of rainfall. Reports revealed the extent of water shortages affecting the region. Take a look at this map from the European Drought Observatory last month. The orange areas are parts of the continent under drought warnings this summer. And these red areas show countries under an alert for drought conditions. Figures for this month aren't available yet, but the recent heat waves in the southern Mediterranean will be putting more pressure on water supplies.
Well, Spain is facing severe water shortages, with reservoirs drying up across the country and restrictions in place in many areas. In some towns, people have been dependent on trucks delivering fresh water each day. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
Life without fresh water on tap. The town of Belmez in Córdoba has relied on water delivery for over 2 months now. Families fill bottles for drinking and cooking water. The Sierra Boyera reservoir is just a 4-minute drive away, but that's been empty since April. It dropped to such low levels that thousands of fish died and the water was deemed unsafe for human consumption.
This is what a dead reservoir looks like. It hasn't rained enough here since 2018 to fill this water basin, and over 80,000 people depend on the Sierra Boyera for fresh water, farming, tourism and industry.
For the first time ever, the people of Belmez, population 3,000, are relying on outside water. Emilio Marquez is a civil protection volunteer and he helps bring water to older residents.
This is criminal. We can't go on like this much longer. The situation is awful. Just awful.
It's sad seeing the town like this. There are a lot of older people who can't manage as well as the young. The Civil Protection Service has to help us.
Temperatures have soared in successive heat waves in Córdoba, reaching above 44 degrees Celsius. These extreme temperatures have exacerbated the drought, increasing evaporation and leaving people in towns like Belmez fearing for the future.
Un pueblo sin agua no tiene futuro, eso está claro.
A town with no water has no future. That's obvious. This used to be a mining area, but the mines were closed by the politicians. Now all that's left is agriculture, livestock and crop farming. And without water, that won't survive either.
Water restrictions have been imposed in over 100 towns and cities across the south of Spain, and conflicts of interests have arisen between environmentalists, farmers and industry. Water conflict has become political too, split along Spain's left-right divide, with the right siding with local farmers and industry, the left in line with the EU's climate action policy. Spain is bearing the brunt of Europe's water problems, which some fear are only just beginning. Ken Brown, CGTN, Córdoba.
Five people, including a 10-year-old girl, have been killed in a Russian airstrike on the southern Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih. Rescuers have been working to free people still trapped in the rubble after the apartment block strike.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky has said that war is returning to Russian territory after 3 Ukrainian drones were shot down over Moscow. Our correspondent Louise Greenwood reports.
Smoke billowing from a 9-story apartment block in the city of Kryvyi Rih, the hometown of Ukraine's President Zelensky. Emergency crews worked against the clock to rescue those still trapped inside.
At around 9 o'clock this morning, 2 missile strikes hit the city. In this 9-story building, the 3rd to 8th floors are totally destroyed. Another missile hit a building at the Economic College. As of now, unfortunately, already 31 people are injured. 1 person is in a serious condition.
It's the latest in a series of missile strikes by Russian forces in recent days across central and southern Ukraine that has killed civilians in Zaporizhzhia, Kherson and Sumy. On Telegram, President Zelensky accused Moscow of stubbornly attacking cities, city centres and shelling civilian objects and housing. Moscow claims that Kyiv is wasting resources in a campaign that's left thousands dead. On the battlefield, both sides claim to be making advances. Ukraine around the besieged city of Bakhmut and Moscow in the south around Zaporizhzhia. In a surprise update, the chief of the Moscow-backed Wagner mercenary group said that while he was not currently recruiting fighters, he was likely to do so again in the future. While it's unclear if new Wagner troops would bolster the effort in Ukraine, Yevgeny Prigozhin said there was a need for what he called a new group that will be better able to protect the interests of our country. But in Ukraine itself, efforts are continuing to remove any trace of Russian influence from its territory. In Kyiv over the weekend, the Soviet hammer and sickle emblem was cut from the city's motherland monument, Europe's tallest statue. Metalsmiths are now at work to replace it with the 3-pronged trident of Ukraine in time for August the 24th, when the nation will celebrate its second Independence Day under Russian attack. Louise Greenwood, CGTN.
Well, let's head to Russia and talk to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova, who's in Moscow. So, Dasha, President Zelensky saying that the war has arrived on Russian territory, and Moscow blaming Ukraine for the drone strikes on Sunday.
That's right. Moscow says those drone attacks against the civilian infrastructure in the Russian cities, and particularly in the Russian capital, were the acts of desperation against the failing counteroffensive by the Ukrainian armed forces. We have heard the Russian officials here insisting very clearly that they do step up the measures to secure Russia's cities, Russia's towns from those terrorist acts. And we have heard the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov saying those attacks against the Russian capital only prove the terrorist nature, as he described it, of the authorities in Kyiv. We also understand that in Moscow the authorities are not going to increase the level of terrorist threat. They do say that the Western countries also have a role in what is happening, saying that they have overseen in the West all those strikes against the Russian capital as well as the Crimea, and Moscow hopes that the acts of terrorism that have been committed by the Ukrainian armed forces will still be regarded by the United Nations and will be given the proper assessment.
And Dasha, Russia's been commenting on the planned peace summit in Saudi Arabia next month.
That's right. Moscow welcomes any initiatives that aims to bring the peaceful solution to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. But at the same time, the Kremlin said it does not see any ground now for the negotiated solution in Ukraine, saying that at the moment Kyiv, quote, cannot and will not regard the possibility of finding the peaceful solution. Of course, Moscow has been saying that the continuous flow of Western weapons to Ukraine is only encouraging the military solution to this conflict. But interestingly, we haven't heard from the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu saying that the mobilization reserve of the Ukrainian armed forces is now very, very slim, because they are hurling the troops that are not ready to the battlefield to attack the Russian Federation. So Moscow is now insisting that even the only result of these negotiations in Saudi Arabia could be, for instance, that the Western countries do understand that the so-called plan of the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is leading to a deadlock. And we have heard from a source here in Moscow suggesting that the solution for the Ukrainian conflict has to involve Russia. Russia has to participate in finding this solution, and also the Russian legitimate interests have to be taken into account.
Dasha, thank you very much. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come, we'll bring you up to date with who's through to the knockout stages of the Women's World Cup.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. The use of tobacco is one of the world's biggest public health threats ever faced, killing over 8 million people a year. That's the conclusion of a new report from the World Health Organization, which says all forms of tobacco use is harmful, with no safe levels of exposure. The world body says of the 8 million deaths annually, 7 million are a result of direct tobacco use, while 1.3 million are non-smokers exposed to second-hand smoke.
However, it also says around 71% of the world's population is now protected by anti-tobacco laws, for example, by ensuring smoke-free indoor areas. Well, Alison Comar is a technical officer from the No Tobacco Unit at the World Health Organization and joins us now. Good to talk to you, Alison. Thanks for coming on. This is the 9th WHO report on the global tobacco epidemic. How has it changed over the years?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Yes, when we look back over the last 15 years, we're quite happy with the level of progress that countries are making in terms of bringing in these tobacco control policies. Because as you said, the death toll is unbelievably high, and the exposure of people to tobacco smoke in public areas is really an unconscionable situation. So as you said, we find that around 1.3 million deaths every year can actually be attributed to exposure to tobacco smoke in public areas. So in our report, we saw that 15 years ago, there were only 10 countries in the world which had a comprehensive ban on smoking in indoor public areas. Now, 15 years later, we have 74 countries who have these excellent bans which protect people. And those 74 countries cover around 25% of the world's population, so there's still a long way to go.
And presumably things have changed. Which countries seem to have the biggest smoking problem now, and why?
Well, we are monitoring what the country's prevalence rates are in smoking, and we find that it's a very wide band of results that countries are having in terms of their efforts. But actually the main problem is that countries' tobacco control efforts are very varied across the world. We see that, well, as we know, there are 182 countries who are parties to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So they've already acknowledged that they want to take efforts in tobacco control. But as we see in our report, not all countries have been able to make great efforts. So the same is reflected in prevalence. We see some countries who are still struggling with such high prevalence rates, 25% of their population daily smoking. We see these countries all over the world. It's really a global problem. In the Pacific Islands, even in Europe, in high-income countries, in Asia, in all corners of the world, we see countries who still have very high rates. So in the report, we tried to calculate what was the average smoking rate globally, and we came up with a number 17%. 17% of the global population of adults are current smokers. Looking back 15 years, there is some good news, because 15 years ago, that number was 22.8, or almost 23% of the adult population of the world was smokers. So on that sense, it's good news. But when you think there's still 1 billion smokers in the world today, there's a lot more to be done.
Indeed. Alison Colmar, thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Some farmers in Kenya are shifting their attention away from growing tobacco as they cater to a more health-conscious consumer.
Migori, a country best known for its tobacco production, is eyeing crop alternatives as a way to protect the community from diseases associated with tobacco consumption.
CGTN's Daniel Arapmoy reports.
Changing market demands and health concerns have left many farmers in Kenya's Migori County struggling to make ends meet, especially non-food crop growers. The new trend has hit hard on tobacco farming, which has been a staple cash crop in the area's economy for decades. Dan Paul Ogola and his family have been growing tobacco for over 4 decades. Ogola says tobacco is no longer as lucrative as it was 20 years ago. His latest bet is sweet potatoes that seem to be paying off.
Tobacco is generally expensive compared to sweet potatoes. First, when you want to plant sweet potato, the requirements are not that much than as compared to tobacco.
Farmers are now being encouraged to produce more sweet potatoes as opposed to tobacco. Domestic demand for the crop has begun to decline as authorities push for alternatives. Farmers here in Kenya's western county of Migori are being provided with alternative crops like maize, beans and avocados to help diversify their income and improve their health. Martin Ocheng, a 31-year-old, has also been farming tobacco for many years. With the market for tobacco becoming increasingly unpredictable, Ocheng has turned to maize production to make a living.
When I was born, I found when my parents are growing tobacco. I don't know the exact year they started growing tobacco, but I found they are growing. And up to now, we are starting switching from tobacco to maize, beans, and other crops like avocado, banana, and others.
The diversification has generated significant opportunities for farmers in the county, where the climate and soil conditions are also ideal for growing vegetables. Other than its effects on farmers' health, experts here say tobacco use is associated with a wide range of health problems.
The tobacco farmer is now like a slave. The tobacco farmer, through the farming, tobacco farmer comes into contact, actually into direct contact with the nicotine, which affects the skin, and then it moves up to other organs. And this is where now we start getting the non-communicable diseases like liver failure, kidney failure.
Many farmers here are progressively abandoning their tobacco bans, a move that is expected to turn around the community's reliance on tobacco as a sole cash crop for the county's economy. Daniel Arap Moi, CGTN, Migori, Kenya.
Football and Australia have cruised into the knockout stage of the World Cup competition after dealing a crushing blow to Olympic champions Canada with a 4-0 victory in Melbourne. Cheered on by the home crowd, the co-hosts put on a spectacular show right up to the last minute, sealing the result with a penalty in stoppage time. This is the first time since 2011 that Canada has left the tournament in the group stages.
Nigeria's Super Falcons are heading to the last 16 after a goalless draw against the Republic of Ireland, who have now been knocked out of the tournament. This is the third time the African sides advanced to the knockout stages in the Cup. Nigeria's next opponents will be decided later this week when the final Group D games are played.
Zambia have clinched their first ever victory at the tournament after beating Costa Rica 3-1. Defender Lushoma Mwimba netted the fastest goal of the tournament so far with a spectacular volley just 2 minutes after kickoff. The victory puts them third in their group, meaning that they will miss out on qualifying for the knockout stages.
Japan won their group after beating Spain 4-0 in a clinical performance by the former champions. They scored 3 in the first half, and despite Spain gaining momentum as the game went on, Japan's defence maintained a clean sheet. They have yet to concede a goal at the tournament. Japan faced Norway in the last 16 on Saturday.
China are preparing for their toughest match yet at the tournament as the Steel Roses get ready to take on England's Lionesses in Australia on Tuesday.
Our correspondent Greg Navarro reports.
All 5 FIFA Women's World Cup matches being played here at the stadium in Adelaide are sold out. On Tuesday night, the expected crowd of about 13,500 people are in for quite a treat when Asian Cup champions China take on European champs England. England currently sits atop Group D in first place after wins over Denmark and Haiti. A win over China would see it advance to the knockout stage in that top spot. A win for China over England would see it advance to the knockout stage for a 7th Women's World Cup. A draw, however, makes things a bit trickier, and its path to the knockout stage really depends on what happens in the game between Denmark and Haiti. That's also being played here in Australia on Tuesday. Now, China won its last match against Haiti by a score of 1-0, and it did so despite being down a player, playing with just 10 players because of a red card to Zhang Rei. Now, England also won its last match. It did so against Denmark by a score of 1-0, but lost its star midfielder, Kira Walsh, due to injury. She is not expected to play here on Tuesday when England faces off against China. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Adelaide.
Our main stories again. Start spending. China acts to stimulate consumer consumption as manufacturing and service activity lose steam in July.
A glimmer of hope. The Eurozone economy shows signs of resilience as its second quarter GDP beats expectations.
And Niger's ousted president seen for the first time since a military coup last week as the leader of neighbouring Chad heads up mediation efforts.
That is it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, it's goodbye.